physically and virtually, to tonight's event marking the 28th yahrzeit, the 28th anniversary of the physical passing of our revered Rebbe in 1994. There is special significance to this event as it is taking place Bekiruv Makoim, in close proximity to the Rebbe's Oyhel, his resting place. Many thanks to the Rabbi Youth Organization and Rabbi Shmuel Biederman for making this event happen year after year. Reb Shmuel, you should be well and strong and continue your good work for the Jewish people ad bias goyel tzedek. My name is Rabbi Yossi Blasovsky, and together with my wife Dina, we direct Chabad of Northeast Queens in Bayside, a few short miles away. 28 years have passed since the Rebbe's physical presence has left us, and the pain has not abated. The massive void that we feel every single day, not seeing the holy countenance of the Rebbe and not hearing his powerful voice, is unfilled. We are here tonight to join together for an evening of connection and inspiration. Our goal is not to feel sad and discouraged, but to come away with a rejuvenated sense of purpose and to pledge to continue and strengthen. 28 has the numerical value of the word koyach, strength, to strengthen our commitment to the Rebbe's mission of spreading the light of Torah and mitzvahs and chassidus to all. When you stop and contemplate the Rebbe, one is immediately struck by the inadequacy of words to somehow capture the essence of this great tzaddik. One can wax eloquent and go on listing the Rebbe's qualities, but will inevitably come up short. The Rebbe's impact on the Jewish world and the world at large is simply unprecedented in the annals of history. There is a fascinating story in the Talmud tractate Baba Metzia. The Talmud describes the unique qualities of one particular rabbi that made him stand head and shoulders above all of his colleagues. Kama gedolim ma'asei chiyah. How great are the actions of Rabbi Chia. But what did he do that was so special? Says the Gemara, the avdi l'Torah de le'tishtakach mi Yisrael. Rabbi Chia was responsible for ensuring that the Torah should not be forgotten from the Jewish people. What did he do? He went out and he sowed flax. From the flax, he made nets. With the nets, he trapped deer. He gave the meat to orphan children, and he used the hide to prepare scrolls upon which he transcribed the Torah. He took those scrolls to towns where there were no teachers, and he taught the children, thereby preserving the Torah from being forgotten in Israel. That set him apart from everyone else. In a post-Holocaust world, there was a very real fear that Torah would be forgotten from Israel. Our very identity was in jeopardy. So many of our brethren around the world were without guidance. In response to this, the Rabbi Chia of our generation, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, set into motion the greatest Jewish revolution of all time, sending shluchim, emissaries, young men and women, to every corner of the globe. Wherever there is a Jewish child who needs someone to teach them Torah, wherever there is a Jew who needs anything at all, there is a shliach, an ambassador of light, ready to do the work. Just look at the devastating conflagration in the Ukraine. The Rebbe's shluchim were the very last to leave their posts and are the first to return to tend to their communities. Kama gedolim ma'asei chia, how great are the actions of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Let us all plead with Almighty God that He send us Mashiach, bring an end to the suffering, and reunite us with the Rebbe and with all the righteous of our people and with all of our loved ones. This should be the very last yortzeit that we commemorate in Golus and exile. Amen. Hasidic philosophy teaches us about the power of tziyur. The images that we look at have a major impact on the viewers. To look at the face of a righteous person has a very positive, powerful effect. So sit forward and focus on a video of the Rebbe.
Anosi bi Israel, was lechiyele ze der Anosi, Loshn is Nasses, a viele Mishichme, is der Echet von Meile Mikol Hom. Aber afal Pikein is Anosi a Reihe Mehemne, doch in Yone, asher Yitzir, asher Yeviye, verbunden mit Zei Hanogi, mit Zei Lifane Parnosse, mit Zei Linyone Chayim. Anosi b'shaser tut auch sicher be'emuno, und demult ist man sich mislabisch, in dem was entlebt von den Mädchen von Moshe Rabbeinu, gedei zurück umzukehren, in dem durch Paris von Amidwe. Dies Ayomim Eilu Niskorim Venasim in der Hilule, Bechol Shona Veshona, Skola Vidose Asherovat Bey. Zato demolti das Nizgale Vimikere Vishorchei, Bisa doce peil Yeshuis dole mato. Ame wird nigal in aviula protiv, mit der Simcha vetur livo, miyad hei nikol in nikula amitis va shleima. Adinoreinu biskeneinu govaneinu bibniseinu, geht mit dem Kabel sein Plei Meshiach Zivkeinu. Die Svadus verbunden mit der Yemi Hilule von Anosi bei Israel, und Yodua Adunyoni Shal Nosi und Melech bei Israel, als ביחד עם זה, וזה זיינו דוח מורם מכל הום, משיחמה ומיילה גובה מכל העם, ביחד עם זה היא nicht nur, als gefindt sich miteinander und gefindt sich בתוכה, ובלושן הכוסף, הום אשר אנכי בקרבי, nicht nur gefindt sich mit dem, gefindt sich בקרבי.
When I went to the Rebbe to discuss my mother's illness, I went for two things. One, obviously, was a bracha. And the second one, it was an eitzah. There was a machlokas among the medical people whether they should operate or not operate. Like a son, I was torn. And my mother, Alaiha Shalom, couldn't make a decision. And so I went to the Rebbe. And just think, the Rebbe didn't know me, didn't know my mother, didn't know anyone from the mishpacha. And when I looked at him, I saw tears. It like as if he was my brother, and I'm talking to my brother about it. And he gave the answer that one must operate. But that's inconsequential. What is of consequence, that not knowing me, and not even knowing I didn't go representing Young Israel, I said nothing about me being in Young Israel. It was purely personal. And to show such empathy, such emotion, such care, such concern, that in itself is remarkable.
Und das beweist sich auf nicht nur Hisanjanus Pnimis, das aber in den Ingen von Hisanjanus, dass sie beholze Rossum leitzo, weil der selber eine Gehe zu Asimcho, und das Ajinina, dass leitzo und dass sein Asimcho.
היינו כבר עמוק בתוך לבנון, במוצבים חודרים, המקום לא היה שקט, שרת שם מחבלים וסכנות. יום אחד התקשרתי להורים שלי לפני יציאה למערב. אבא שלי אמר לי שהיה טלפון מהמזכירות, ואמרו כיוון שבחנוכה, יום ההולדת שלי, הרבי מבקש שאני אחגוג, שאני אתוועד ביום הולדת. זה היה נראה מאוד מאוד חריג. לא יצרתי קשר עם הרבי בזמן האחרון, אני בצבא מתעסק איתו. למחרת התקשרתי שוב, אבי אמר לי שהתקשרו שוב מהמזכירות, ואמרו שנותנים לי תפילין מתנה, שהרבי נותן תפילין. יש לי תפילין שאבא שלי קנה לי לבר מצווה. אז בעצם אמר לי שהוא כתב כמו שהוא מבקש על כל המשפחה. הוא הזכיר לרבי על נושא שאני נמצא בלבנון, נמצא במקום מסוכן, אני לא נמצא כרגע בישיבה, במקום שהוא מוגן יותר. והרבי פשוט הבין שצריך שמירה מיוחדת, אני ולכל הפלוגה.
I wasn't 770, I was a Talmud in Yeshiva, so Leibel Posner tells me he knows a very nice girl, he thinks it would be a very good shidduch for you. Okay. So we have a contact with letters, and a contact from time to time whenever she'll be able to come. I got a letter from her, letter number 8. Always the Rebbe used to take a quick look at the letter like this, and say, this and das sollst du entfangen. Darf man entfangen auf dem Brief. This time the Rebbe took a quick look. Sholem, sie ist nicht für dir. So, when the Rebbe says she's not for this, so I know with her I should forget it. But one thing, I got so happy about that. What's the happiness? It can sein that I'm losing her, whatever it is. I got happy, Punkt verkehrt. If it wouldn't be a Rebbe, and to continue alle Sachen, I would marry her a long time ago again. And if sie nicht for dir, she's no good to marry you. So I'm very happy that the Rebbe told me she's nicht for dir. And I started going out like with tears in the eyes from Simcha. I'm not crying or tears. But this was something special.
Was sich Tafkide von jeder Nossi, nächster Platz asher Yitzi vasher Yevi, was sich mislabisch und misanien und tut kol atolibe, in kol hoinyoni deire asher Yitzi vasher Yevi, tut das na nefischer Nisio von Aufheben sei.
הרבי יושב אלפי קילומטר מפה, ודואג לאיזה נער, איזה חייל שיושב בלבנון, שיעשה יום הולדת. יש לרבי אלפי חסידים, יש לו בתי חב"ד, ופתאום הוא דואג לי שאני יושב אי שמה בלבנון, וחושב, ודואג לי מה לעשות, שיהיה לי בסדר.
Can relate to every yochid and to relate to a klal, and with the same intensity. That is what we call a gadol Yisrael.
Nicht stam gegeben, das gegeben von mit einer Leben von Teil ein.
Coming close to the door, I give a turn to the Rebbe. Rebbe, b'mezochisi. And your question, the Rebbe gives a look, the way the Rebbe can give a look. He says, a Rebbe und a Tate sucht nicht kein Schusim auf die Kinder. Tut für sie, whatever mit darf tun. Getan, was gedacht. That's what the Rebbe answered.
Dieser Gedusche einer Sosen in Kemo, Allahas Kammer und Kammer, als Rezach wegen Anossi bei Israel, ist sicher als Pulose, asher Kol, Meshach, Kol, Yemei Chayo, ist es Apulo Nimsheches.
We have the privilege of having with us tonight Mr. Avraham Biederman, a very chashuv yid. Just a little bit of his bio. From 1983 to 1986, he served as special advisor to Mayor Koch. From 86 to 88, he served as Commissioner of Finance for New York City. From 88 to 89, he was New York City's Housing Commissioner. He also serves as co-chairman of the World Jewish Restitution Organization, vice president of the Claims Conference, and much, much more. In the course of his communal work, Mr. Biederman had the privilege of meeting with the Rebbe. We are honored that he will share some of those personal encounters with us tonight. Mr. Avraham Biederman.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi Botman, for having me. My kesher with the Rebbe doesn't start with the day I got into communal life, but it really precedes it by a long, long time. I grew up in a home that was Hasidic, but not Chabad. But my wife, who Baruch Hashem married quite a long time now, her family was Chabad and is Chabad, and she came from a family that was Chabad not just in America, but deep in Russia for generations. And her grandmother's maiden name was Rabashkin. That's a name that probably many of you know because our cousin became world famous because of his emunah and bitochen when he was in jail and when he went out of jail. So that our kesher started very, very long time ago and continued throughout the Rebbe's life when we were together many times. In fact, my shadchan was somebody called Rabbi Alter Metzger. Some of you may know him. He is a very prominent Chabad rabbi. And all he wanted to do with his shadchanis is to read the letter of the Lubavitcher Rebbe under the chuppah, which of course he did. And that was a personalized letter which the Rebbe used to write to Chabad Hasidim when they got married. And we had the chus to go to the Rebbe many times in different times in our life before we got married and when we had children. So we had the chidus. In those days it was still possible to go in privately to the Rebbe. It was a little quieter than it became later. And we had many, many opportunities to interact with the Rebbe on a personal level. And when I was in the government, I was in the government for many years before that, but I was in the state controller's office in New York. I'm a CPA by profession, but I joined the government early in my career. And after that, I went to work in the Koch administration, and the story that I'm going to tell you relates to my activities there. But before that, when I did become housing commissioner, it was a very big job with a lot of people working for me and a lot of interactions with different communities. And I went into the Rebbe for a bracha, and I told the Rebbe, of course in Yiddish, but I'll speak in Hebrew now, in English. I asked the bracha that when in my new job I should be able to help fellow Yidden. And the Rebbe told me right away, you shouldn't just help Yidden, you should help Yidden and Jews and non-Jews, and this way you'll make a big Kiddush Hashem. And that was the advice I tried to follow, and Baruch Hashem was Matzliach. This is a political story, but it's not about politics. It's really about the koyach of a Manig Yisrael to see into the future in ways that are truly inexplicable if you weren't there. So Ed Koch, for those, I don't know, I assume some of you are from New York, some of you may not be, but most of you probably heard of him if you're over a certain age. Ed Koch was the mayor of New York for 12 years. He was a very, very popular mayor, to the point where in 1981 he ran unopposed. Both the Democrat and Republican parties had him as their candidate, so he had no opposition. And in 1985 he did have opposition, but the results were 80-20. Now, normally a landslide is like 55-45, 80-20 is like a joke. It means the other candidate really didn't register at all. So he was running now in 1985, and then in 1989 he wanted to run for what would have been an unprecedented fourth term. And he was still popular. The third term was not as easy as the other term, so it was not as popular as he was. And he was running against, there were two elections. First, in New York, if you're familiar with most places, there's a general election and there's a primary. And he ran in the primary against David Dinkins, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. So now, there was a tradition in New York, whether you were a Chabad Chassid or not, that before an election, that you would go to get a bracha from the Rebbe, to usually get $1 or more. And that was a great photo op, whether you were a big chassid or not, but it was a great photo op because the Rebbe had so many followers and was so famous. And so in 1989, we were running in the primary now against David Dinkins. And the primary was in September. Now they've moved it to June, and in fact, today is primary day in New York. But then it was in September. And so about 6 or 8 weeks before, the mayor decided he wants to go to get a bracha from the Rebbe. And all the press was invited, and the report was there from every single station. They made the news on every station the next day. This is pre-internet, when it was really, all news came from print media, mostly on TV. So we go to the Rebbe. Now, this was the beginning of August. The primary was about 6 weeks away. At that point, it wasn't looking like an 80-20 election, but it still was, the polls were very healthy for the mayor. We were, at the beginning, August 1st, we were up about 15 points. And David Dinkins was a nice man, but certainly was not considered a leader, and certainly not in the caliber of Ed Koch, who was definitely a leader, world leader, and well-known all over the place. So we go to the Rebbe for a bracha. The Rebbe, this is all in public view. The Rebbe takes Koch very nicely, and he gives him not $1 but $2. And there's a conversation that ensues. It was not a very substantive conversation. It was about and the Rebbe was very, very polite to him. A few minutes into the conversation, the mayor turns to the Rebbe and says something which was pretty, not really surprising. He said, Rebbe, it's an honor to be in your presence. You're a great leader of the people, the Jewish people. And I'm looking forward to come back again next year as mayor and to be with you again and receive your blessing. Now, normally, when somebody makes that kind of statement, the normal reaction, yes, 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 of course. But the Rebbe didn't say that. The Rebbe said, I am not a prophet. Now, I was a little more attuned to Hasidim and Rebbes than Ed Koch was. And that was, to me, a very unpredictable statement. I would never have imagined the Rebbe saying that. I was wondering why. I mean, we were way, way up in the polls, like 15 points, which is still a landslide. Everything looked positive. And we weren't asking the Rebbe for an endorsement. We were just saying, looking forward to coming back. And the Rebbe said, no, I am not a prophet. Okay. The conversation continues. And finally, about 5 minutes later, we're ready to leave. And after some more conversation, and again, the Mayor Koch says to the Rebbe, it was an honor to be in your presence, and I really look forward to coming back again next year and again receiving your bracha. And the Rebbe tells him, and this is on videotape somewhere, you can probably find it. And I was there, there weren't, it wasn't really, there was some shluchim of the Rebbe were there, some of the Gaboyim, and the Rebbe tells him, and this is even stranger than the first comment, and the Rebbe says, you are trying to make me into a prophet. I already told you I'm not a prophet. Now, Ed Koch was not, I would say, a big Chabad chassid or any chassid of any Rebbe or any, but when he walked out, the press didn't notice it because this was a private time. So in the front page picture of the Post of the news, they had a big picture of the Rebbe giving him $2, and it was all beautiful. But even Koch, who was very not attuned to Rebbes and how they spoke, said, he tells me that wasn't much of an endorsement. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't understand what's going on here. Because the Rebbe first tells him, I am not a prophet. And then he repeats it and says, I already told you I'm not a prophet. So this was about the first week in August. I don't remember the exact date. It was a Sunday. You can look it up. August of '89. Then about a week later, those of you who are old-time New Yorkers might remember this, there was an incident where a black fellow, young man, went into Bensonhurst. At that point, Bensonhurst was almost entirely Italian. It's not the same anymore. It's more Chinese than Italian today. And there were a few thugs jumped on him and stabbed him. And this was, an unprovoked attack on this young man, strictly because of race. And it played very, very poorly in the press. And people began to blame Ed Koch for, inciting racial tensions, and people were getting stabbed for no reason. And, he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't there, and he certainly didn't approve of what was happening. But nonetheless, he was the mayor. And he used to say that if you're the mayor and a bird falls out of a tree in Central Park, it's your fault. So here there was an incident that was a lot more serious than that. And so it clearly began to affect his poll numbers. That was incident number one. Then about a week or two later, we're now still in August, but the second part of August, there was an incident in a neighborhood called Howard Beach. And again, those of you who are long-time New Yorkers will know where this is. Howard Beach was also a very, I believe, Irish Catholic neighborhood. And again, there was a minority young man who came into the neighborhood. And for I don't know exactly what happened. Maybe they thought he was committing a crime. Maybe they thought he might want to commit a crime, or maybe he did try to commit a crime. I don't know exactly. But a few young ruffians chased him into the gutter. And he ran for his life, and he got hit by a car and died. And that was a really, really terrible incident in New York, because again, this was under our watch, under the Mayor Koch's watch, and somebody innocently was killed because of his race, and he was clearly innocent because I don't think he did anything, and he was murdered. He wasn't just the other fellow in Bensonhurst was stabbed, but he survived. This fellow actually died, unfortunately. And the press began to take a very negative view of the mayor, because they felt that he somehow was stoking racial tension. He wasn't reaching out enough to the black community. and the numbers began to fall. And we go into early September, and we're no longer up 15 points, even though it looked like a shoo-in. Again, this is his fourth run. The last one was unopposed, one was 80-20, and now all of a sudden he's into his fourth one, and what looked like a shoo-in a few weeks before, all of a sudden is no longer so positive. Comes election day, the polls were up. We were up in the beginning of the night. By the time the night ended, David Dinkins had won the primary, and he beat the mayor by about 150,000 votes, which is roughly 15%. So instead of being up 15, we ended up being down 15. Now I realized that even though the Rebbe said he's not a prophet, he really was a prophet, because he said something that if you had asked anybody 6 weeks earlier who would win, I would say that the number of people who would say Dinkins was maybe 5%. And the Rebbe never told Koch he wouldn't win, but he told him twice, I am not a prophet. Now, David Dinkins was a Democrat, and Ed Koch was a Democrat. And so Koch calls me the next day and said, listen, we lost the primary, but we lost it to a fellow Democrat, and we have to support him. Even though we lost to him and it was not a pretty election, but we have to support him, and he will be the candidate running on the Democratic Party. And at that point, he would be running against Rudy Giuliani. This was 1989. This is the first time that Giuliani ran. And so even though I lost to him and it was ugly, we're going to support him. The next day, there was a big rally in the front of City Hall, and the mayor was there holding up David Dinkins' hands up high, and they were celebrating together. And now we're moving towards a general election. The general election is, the primary was in September. The general election would be in November, roughly 2 months later. It comes around Yontif time, sometime in October, I don't remember exactly when. The mayor calls me and says, David Dinkins wants to go see the Lubavitcher Rebbe, like any candidate who was running and would want to do. But he doesn't have any really relationship with the Rebbe, and he doesn't have his relationship with his followers or people. And so he wants somebody to go with him. And I knew him very well because before he was mayor, he was the borough president of Manhattan. And as housing commissioner, I interacted with him, not on a daily basis, but at least more than once a week. So he really feels uncomfortable going on his own, and he wants you to come with him. I said, okay. So, I mean, again, we were part of the party, and we were following the endorsement of the mayor to stick with the Democrats. Where, later on, by the way, parenthetically, in 1993, when Dinkins ran again against Giuliani, Koch was on Giuliani's side this time, when he saw the terrible Khurban that Dinkins made, of course, with the terrible riots in Crown Heights. But this was before that, and he seemed like benign. He didn't seem good, but he didn't seem bad either, so we were supporting him. So we go to the Rebbe, and again, the press is all there. This is now 3-4 weeks before the general election. It's a very tight election. And we're in there for a few minutes, and the Rebbe is very, very nice to him. And he also gives him, just like he gave to Ed Koch, he gives him $2. And then this is now the part that's amazing. And the only person who was, of course, besides the Rebbe, who was at both events was me. And the Rebbe's Gabbai, Rabbi Groner, was there as well. I'm not sure if he linked the two incidents or if he remembered the two incidents, but I certainly did. And David Dinkins turns to the mayor, to the Rebbe, and says, Rebbe, it was an honor to be in your presence. And I look forward to coming back next year as mayor and again to receive your bracha. And the Rebbe says, he didn't say this time, I'm not a prophet. He says, I am looking forward to it also. And I said, I can't believe this. Because here, this exact same conversation took place probably 4 or 5 weeks earlier. And I remember the Rebbe saying something which was very surprising and out of the norm. I would have thought it was out of the norm. He said, he didn't tell David Dinkins I'm not a prophet. He didn't say, you trying to make me into a prophet? He said, no, I'm looking forward to it. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I really know I don't have to wait for an election night. And a few weeks later, the general election took place. And the Rebbe blessing and the Rebbe's prediction, Nevuah, maybe you could really only call it Nevuah because it wasn't clear at all that Dinkins would win, because he wasn't viewed as a strong candidate even after winning the primary. It was more like if you were pro-Koch or anti-Koch. It wasn't really if you were pro-Dinkins so much. And Giuliani was a very charismatic figure at that time, and of course he proved as mayor. And so he won. And he won by a very, very small number of votes. He won by like 30 less than 40,000 votes. But the Rebbe's bracha and the Rebbe's prediction came true in two exact situations, one which was totally counterintuitive, and the other one which was also maybe a little less counterintuitive, but nonetheless so. In this case, he said what will happen, and he said, I'm not a prophet when he was, and in the other case, he said, I'm looking forward to it, and that's what happened. So here you have somebody, Messiah Lefi Tumah, the Rebbe. He wasn't engaged in political. He didn't look at any polls. He didn't look at any predictions, but he had a special Ziyata D'Shmaya and a bracha from the Rebbeinu Shloim, and this we saw on many other occasions as well. I'm not going to get into all of them, but where somebody could be walking on this earth, but his head is in the sky, and he knows what's going on. He knows what's going to happen, and I was the only political person. Again, the Rebbe was there, of course. His Gabbai was there. Whether they remember the different conversations, I don't know. But I certainly did, because I was tuned to it politically. And here was the Rebbe, definitely not a political person, but making, with his special schus and special habata, and he looked at it, and he knew exactly what was going to happen in this case. He knew exactly what was going to happen in that case. And whatever he said, it came true. And I had personal incidents like that as well. I don't think they're really for public consumption, but you're not looking at somebody who was just somebody who was a big Talmud Chacham and Gadol. He was more than that. He was really a Navi Hashem. So I'm happy to be here and to give people a little insight in a little bit that I saw the Rebbe. And of course, there are many people here. I suspect they were there many more. I was probably there about 8-10 times. But in each one, we saw things that really l'ma'ala m'derech hateva. Good night.
Thank you so much, Mr. Biederman, for your amazing stories, inspiring words. To address tonight's theme, the Rebbe's vision and continued impact on world Jewry, I'd like to call upon a dear friend, Rabbi Efraim Mintz. Rabbi Mintz is the executive director of the Roar Jewish Learning Institute, known simply throughout the world as JLI. The Rebbe spoke often when addressing his vision of spreading light throughout the world. The central place that Torah study has in, so to speak, conquering the world and making it a dwelling place for Hashem. JLI, with its plethora of cutting-edge Torah offerings in every language, to every level, has done wonders towards this goal. Rabbi Efraim Mintz.
Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Bolsovsky, fellow shluchim, and all those gathered tonight as we prepare to mark, as we heard earlier, 28 years since Gimel Tammuz, since we're no longer able to see, to encounter physically the Rebbe's presence. It was 1971 when Hasidim around the world, together with world Jewry, was about to celebrate, to mark, to commemorate the Rebbe's 70th birthday. And many have arrived to both give and receive blessings to and from the Rebbe. Many dignitaries, rabbis, educators, leaders from different communities, and among them was the noted American author Chaim Potok, who many of you may recall. And he at the time lived in Philadelphia, and I heard this story from the person who drove him into New York to meet with the Rebbe around Yud Aleph Nisan, which was the day marking the Rebbe's birthday. And he decided, I'm coming to visit the Rebbe, I may as well take with me as a gift his latest book that he published. And as he came into New York, he had a chance to meet face to face with the Rebbe. And as he meets the Rebbe, he hands the Rebbe his book. The Rebbe takes the book from Chaim Potok, and the Rebbe immediately asks Chaim Potok, who presented the book to the Rebbe. It was a book about, as many of his books, about the challenges of being Jewish in America, having grown up himself within an Orthodox family, having gone to yeshiva. He went to Yeshiva University, and later on he explored the world, and he kind of disconnected from his youthful roots. And this book, as well as others that he wrote, was very much about the struggle of the Jew struggling with America and all that America has to offer. So he hands the book to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asks Chaim Potok, Chaim, can I ask you a question? And of course Chaim says, yes, Rebbe. And at that moment the Rebbe asks Chaim Potok, Chaim, did you write this book as an insider looking out or as an outsider looking in? Those were the words the Rebbe asks Chaim Potok. He immediately connected, he understood the question. The question deeply resonated with Chaim Potok. Obviously, the question was, as you write about America, about a Jew struggling in America, did you write it as a member, as a card-carrying proud Jew who happens to live in America? Or did you write the book as an American citizen looking what's happening within the Jewish community, but seeing yourself as an outsider? This question deeply resonated with and moved Chaim Potok. In fact, he was silent. He was unable to answer the question. And I heard from the person who was with him, who drove him back to Philadelphia, he said, for the 2.5-hour drive back to Philadelphia, while on the way to New York, he was very talkative, and he spoke. On the way back, he remained silent throughout, deeply immersed in that question that the Rebbe posed to Chaim Potok. My friends, that question that the Rebbe posed at the time in 1971 to Chaim Potok is a question that the Rebbe, that Torah, that Yiddishkeit poses to each and every one of us. We each live within and are part of our local community. We engage, we go to shul, some more often than others. We go to classes, some more often than others. We engage, some more often than others. But oftentimes, that question could and perhaps should be asked of us as well. Are we engaged in Judaism, in our local Chabad house, in our local community, as an insider, looking out at what's happening at the broader world, the greater society? Or are we an outsider that from time to time chooses to step inside and participate only to return back to our outsider self? And I would like to share with you tonight, as we sit together in Fabrein just days before Gimel Tammuz, on this most auspicious day, where Hasidim and world Jewry prepares to mark this day by connecting, by strengthening our connection to the Rebbe, through learning his teachings and internalizing the Rebbe's message to each and every one of us. And I call your attention to a story, one of the most famous or infamous stories in Jewish history. We all know that shortly after the receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, Moses comes down from the mountain to be confronted by a most shocking scene. Barely a month has passed since receiving the Torah, and a number of Jews have rebelled and built an idol, a golden calf. We know that moment, etched in Jewish history, a moment for which we still carry the burden of those choices made by several Jews. In a display of supreme displeasure, Moses takes the luchos, takes the tablets, and smashes the tablets. The Midrash asks, why? Why did Moses choose to shatter the tablets? Various answers are given to this question. I share with you one from one of the Rebbe's talks with a profound lesson. Moses looked at the tablets, and we're told that at that moment, the writing on the tablets, the 10 Commandments, disappeared. They no longer remain connected, engraved within the tablets. So Moses looks at the tablets and sees it no longer carries a message. He decides and he declares, Ein bo mamish. It no longer has any significance. And therefore he took the tablets, and he shattered the tablets. The Rebbe asks, while the words, the message, may no longer be present on the tablets, we're told, was Maaseh Elokim. The tablets were the handiwork of God. It may not have carried a message, but the tablets were sacred, godly, divinely crafted. How did Moshe take the divinely crafted handiwork of Hashem and just smash them? And the Rebbe teaches us a profound lesson. The Rebbe says, of course the tablets were Maaseh Elokim. Of course the tablets were the handiwork of God, and they were sacred and holy and had immense value. However, once it received greater value, once the tablets now hold a message, once they were inscripted with Michtav Elokim, now that they carry a message, its previous value of Maaseh Elokim is no longer significant. Hence, while it once carried value, once it ascended, once its value rose and increased by Michtav Elokim, the fact that it was Maaseh Elokim was no longer of any significance. And the Rebbe says, from here we learn a message and we take a lesson that's profoundly relevant to us in our lives. A message when Moses shattered the tablets, he was essentially conveying to us, displaying to us the shattering of the comfort zone of complacency. In our lives, we make choices. We are faced with choices every day, says the Rebbe. We can choose to rise to the occasion or remain settled in our comfort zone and fall into the trap of complacency. By Moshe taking the tablets and smashing the tablets, he sends a message, a most positive message to the Jews then and to the Jews throughout history. Never to be satisfied with the comfort of complacency. Always seek how we can rise above. It may be uncomfortable. It may require courage, strength, and it may be painful. But that is the message from the smashing of the tablets. In fact, says the Rebbe, this is why when the Jews went into battle, you know what they took with them? They took with them the Shivrei Luchot, the broken tablets. Because when they went into the battlefield, they needed desperately to carry and to internalize this message of not to be complacent. We are going into the battlefield, and we need to carry this message with us. My friends, this message is one that is reflected in the Rebbe's teachings, the Rebbe's philosophy, the Rebbe's perspective, in his many talks and letters and teachings throughout the many years of his leadership. But how do we rise above and escape that comfort zone of complacency? In the 60s and early 70s, there was an interesting guest, a frequent visitor at 770, at Lubavitch World Headquarters. He was spending time with the yeshiva students. He was conversing with them late into the night, and they discovered a while later that this person was none other than a noted Reform rabbi and a prominent author by the name of Herbert Wiener, who decided to delve into, to study, to analyze, and eventually to write about Hasidim, Chabad Hasidim, and their leader, the Rebbe. And in fact, on one occasion, Rabbi Wiener asked for and was granted a rare opportunity to interview the Rebbe. The Rebbe agreed to be interviewed by Herbert Wiener. And I want to share with you the few words that Herbert Wiener writes. I quote from his own account. At one point during this interview, Yechidus, personal audience with the Rebbe, he turns to the Rebbe and says, Rebbe, all Hasidim, all of your Hasidim seem to have one thing in common, a sort of open and naive look in their eyes that a sympathetic observer might call tmimut, or sincerity, but that might be less kindly, but that might less kindly be interpreted as emptiness, he writes, emptiness, simple-mindedness, the absence of inner struggle, a less than favorable description. The Rebbe leaned over to Herbert Wiener in response to his comment, in response to his observation, and said the following: what you see missing from their eyes is a kera. A kera? He asked the Rebbe, what is a kera? The Rebbe was using the Hebrew word. Yes, says the Rebbe, a kera, and he repeated, and now translated, a split. This split, explained the Rebbe, is what comes from trying to live in two worlds. And the Rebbe was saying that what you see absent in the eyes of these yeshiva students, these young Hasidim, they're living fully, wholeheartedly, and comfortably in one world. They are not living in two separate worlds, and we can very much relate to this. The dichotomy of life, even among those who are engaged, observant, living, and active in Torah, in Judaism, there's a divide that we oftentimes encounter. There's a gap between that which is holy and mundane, between the synagogue and our homes, between Shabbat and an ordinary weekday, between the forces of good and the opposite. And oftentimes we encounter this dichotomy, this divide, even within us. How often do we suddenly encounter our selfless self, prepared to go above and beyond, to be there for someone else, to rise above our ordinary, natural, mundane self, and suddenly we hear ourselves saying, or we see ourselves acting in a manner that we're proud of what we just said or just did, only to fall back shortly thereafter to our selfish self. We live in a very, very dichotomized world, a dichotomy that's reflected in almost every area of life. This taught the Rebbe. This teaches the Rebbe this gap, this delusional gap between two worlds is not genuine, it's not real. The Rebbe dedicated his life and urged us to dedicate ours to close that gap between the synagogue and our living rooms, between Shabbat and an ordinary Wednesday, between the neshama, the soul of Judaism, and our personal soul, and the body of Judaism and our personal mundane life. Take, for example, the public menorahs which you've all seen in towns and city squares in every community across the United States and the world. Not only is the menorah meant to celebrate Hanukkah and to take its message to the streets and to impress upon the young minds and hearts who are challenged with mixed messages during that time of year, but taking and building a menorah in the center of towns and cities across the world is meant to demonstrate the closure of that gap. The town square is no less godly or divine than the synagogue. Our living rooms and the synagogues are one seamless venue and zone for the expression, the realization of God's will, of Torah and mitzvahs. This is a central theme and message echoed and expressed throughout the Rebbe's teachings. And this allows us to have a better sense of not only the world around us and to close that gap, but to have a better sense of who we are. You know, the story is told about a person, a simpleton, a yid, what you may call a bit of a shlemazel, and he was traveling in the bitter cold in Russia, from shtetl to shtetl, and he had all these belongings with him, his luggage and bags and packages, and he rushed to make the train one evening, only to discover that the train was canceled and postponed to the next morning because of the bitter cold, the snow that prevented travel. So he took all his belongings and he schleps everything together, and he finally manages to walk a kilometer to the closest inn, to the closest krechma. But to his mazel, all other passengers had made it there before him, and he was left with no room. There was no longer vacancy in this inn, in this krechma. He comes to the front desk and he pleads with the innkeeper. He says, "Look at me. I'm so exhausted. I've been traveling and schlepping all day. Please give me anything you have, a bed anywhere." He said, "I'm sorry, I would love to help you. We're full. We're at full occupancy." Begging and pleading, the innkeeper had some rachmanis, some mercy on this fellow, and he said, "I'll tell you what. There's one room, a large, nice suite that I have that has 2 beds. On one of the beds, there's a Russian general who came in completely drunk a few hours ago. I will allow you to sleep on the other bed if you promise me you will remain as quiet as possible, and I will wake you up 5:30 in the morning to make the 6 o'clock train. You got a deal." He was so thankful, and he makes his way into this room quietly, kept the lights off, says that the traditional bedtime Shema, and goes to sleep. Of course, 5:30, the innkeeper wakes him up, quietly takes his clothing, quickly gets dressed, and makes his way out of the room to catch the 6 o'clock train. Now, what he didn't realize was that as he got dressed in the dark, he mistakenly put on the garb of the Russian general. So he walks out of the room, and suddenly, this never happened to him before in his life, whoever he passes welcomes him with a hearty good morning. This never happened to him, but he's enjoying every moment. Leaves the hotel, the inn, people are moving on the side, letting him go before them, comes to the line to get his ticket. Everyone steps aside and allows him ahead of the line. mind, this never happened to me. He has no clue why this is happening, but again, he's relishing and enjoying every moment. He comes to the ticket booth. The clerk takes a look and says, "For you, sir," and he hands him a first-class ticket. He is enjoying every moment. Again, totally at a loss of why he's being treated with this royal treatment. Comes onto the train for the first time in his life. He's sitting in the first class of the train. The train takes off, and he starts walking around first class, and he passes a large wall with floor-to-ceiling mirrors. And he finally gets a glimpse, and he sees his new self, his new garb. And this Yid, this Shlemazel, this Yid says, "Oy vey," he says to himself, "the innkeeper woke up the wrong person. I will never make my train." My friends, it's a nice joke, but like many jokes, this has a lot of truth to it. We oftentimes identify ourselves not by who we are, but by what we do, by the garbs we wear, by the things we said and do, or by the way others identify ourselves. And at times we could live for years, for decades, thinking that we are the person in that garb and failing to tap into, failing to come in contact with, failing to be the true neshama, the true real person we are destined to be. On one occasion, the chief rabbi of Romania, Rabbi Moshe Rosen, once came to visit the Rebbe. And he had an appointment, a yechidus, late night, midnight or after midnight. And as he was passing by the Rebbe's room, he came early, he spent some time in 770 with the yeshiva students. The Rebbe notices him. And the Rebbe motions Rabbi Rosen to come in. Rabbi Rosen says, pointing to his watch, "My time is later, I'll come in. No worries, I'll come in at the time designated." To which the Rebbe looked at Rabbi Rosen and said the following words. "How," he said in Yiddish, and I'll translate, "how can I allow 20,000 Jews to remain standing by my doorstep?" For as you know, Rabbi Rosen was the chief rabbi of Romania. At the time, there were about 20,000 Jews living there. The Rebbe did not look at him as an individual. The Rebbe looked at him and looks at every single one of us, not by who we are or by the garb we seem to wear or identify ourselves by, but by who we could be, by the potential that every single one of us has. And that reflects the teaching, the philosophy, the message that we are internalizing as we prepare for this special day. I want to conclude by summarizing the key messages that we share tonight. The Rebbe urges us to shatter the comfort of complacency. The Rebbe urges us not to see the world as divided, but to see it as one seamless whole, all of which are eligible and applicable to hear Torah and mitzvahs, and we are the agents meant to deliver that. And who in us is the agent, the neshama, that is our true identity. And finally, we can now understand why Hasidim would have a custom throughout the ages that they would consider the first time they met the Rebbe, the first time a Chassid would have his personal audience with the Rebbe, they would consider that day as their birthday. You may ask, why? Why is that a birthday? Because once we discover the Rebbe and we connect ourselves to the Rebbe, and we do so today by learning, by studying the Rebbe's teachings, by internalizing these messages and making them part of our life, it is indeed our birthday. For we discover a new self. We are able to discover and identify with a person that I never knew existed. Indeed, it's my birthday. It's our Yom Holedes, our birthday, when we are able to identify, discover, and connect to the I, to the self, through the lens of the Rebbe. And I'll finish. Many years ago, when the previous Rebbe became a citizen, and they sent several Hasidim in Manhattan to fill out paperwork. Among them, there was a great Chassid, Rabbi Shmuel Levittin, and he took with him a youngster. They went up to a very high building in Manhattan, the Chrysler Building, and they walked out of the elevator to the 60th or 70th floor of this tall Manhattan building, and suddenly this elderly Chassid looked down to the floor, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he suddenly saw the world from a vantage point that he never saw. We're oftentimes used to seeing from a high place a small people, small cars, small vehicles, small buildings, and he suddenly was aghast. He never saw the world from such a vantage point, and he grabs the arm of this young American yeshiva student and he says, Yitzchak, he turned to him and he said, take a look. When we lift ourselves a little bit higher, all of the world becomes miniature and insignificant. My friends, when we learn Torah, and especially the Rebbe's Torah, the world around us, the challenges, the mountains of worries, the mountains of oivei that we live with on a day-to-day suddenly disappears. It melts away. It becomes miniature and insignificant. So may I suggest tonight, as we conclude and continue with our program, that we take upon ourselves specifically to study the Rebbe's Torah. Whether it's 5 minutes a day, a few minutes a day, to read something. It's accessible everywhere today in books, online, in videos. And by connecting to Torah, in particular the Rebbe's Torah, it's an elevator. And the more we learn, the higher it takes us, and the challenges around us suddenly become miniature and insignificant. And this is the best way to prepare for this auspicious day, Gimel Tammuz, as we strengthen our connection to the Rebbe. But ultimately, it's the ultimate preparation for the day that we will be reunited with the Rebbe, as we, together with all Jews around the world, will march with the Rebbe B'Roshenu, with the Rebbe leading us out of Golus, and we reunited in our homeland in Eretz Yisrael with our loved ones throughout history. May it happen speedily in our days. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Mintz, for your heartfelt, inspirational words. This concludes the official part of the program. We encourage everyone present to take this opportunity and visit the Oihel. Encourage your friends to come as well. Have a good night, and Besuras Tov is only good news. Thank you.